Alright, so I just got back from the ironing board, and as you can see, my collar is a lot more flat, and we can really see this point a little bit more. Now if you find that it's not as pointed as you would like, just come back in with your scissor and again gently kind of push that out a little bit. I think that helped it come to a little bit more of a point. Alright, so now what we're going to do is we're going to start assembling our bodice with this collar and putting all of our units together. So what we need to do first is we need to lay out your bodice flat with the right side up facing you, because whenever we sew a seam we always put our right sides together. And we want to identify that notched part on our collar and go ahead and place that. Make sure that you place your under collar, so that interfacing side, on the bottom when you go ahead and kind of layer these up. And we want to try to line up those notches so they're right there around the shoulder seam point. So I'm just going to go ahead and start there by lining up my notches at my shoulder seam. So put a pin in there, and then I'm just going to work my way towards the front, and hopefully this this seam where everything closed off here, hopefully that will line up with your 5/8 inch notch. So just be kind of gentle as you go around. And what you might find to be helpful is, because we're going into a fairly tight curve at both the front and the back, and we're going to be seaming this at 1/4 inch. So what I would suggest doing is be very cautious when you do this, but just gently clip in into the inside part of your collar that hasn't been sewn into a seam yet. Give yourself a little bit of clipping, because what that does is when you go ahead and open that up, it allows you to really fit curves. We did this step when we were doing our princess seams on our princess seams, when we did kind of our curved darts on our bodice. And it's the same idea, is that whenever we're fitting something a little bit more straight into a curve, we want to do some slight clipping so that we can expand that fabric to fit around a curved line. So I did some clipping on the front and on the back half of that collar. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of put my left hand underneath, and I'm going to match up these raw edges. And I'm going to put in quite a few pins, because I think when you're working with, and if you want to go ahead and kind of manipulate this fabric so that this this once curved edge was is a little bit more straight, you can, or you can try to just try to have these match up as best that you can without having some excess bulk. Oh man, I just pulled my pins out. Just wanted to pull out one, and I ended up pulling them both out. Darn it. Alright, so I'm going to put that pin back at my shoulder seam. And then maybe what I might do is I might try to match up that front seam there, and see if I can get them to fit as best that I can. Sometimes that helps a little bit too, if you know you need to match up your areas together. So I started at the shoulder, and then I matched up my front, and then I'm just going to come back in and match up all of these curved parts here along the inside of that neckline. And again, if you need to like manipulate some of that fabric, always look at the front and the back of that seam, being like, okay, do I have any excess bulk going on? Do I need to just shift some fabric around to get this 1/4 inch seam to lay flat? Because we really don't want to have any really strange creases. And if you find that you need to hold your fabric down a little bit lower, so it's just like kind of pulling in the right direction, put a pin down there to hold that in place. Alright, I'm meeting back up with my shoulder seam here. And then once I've got that shoulder seam, I'm just going to match up my back ones as well. So again, I kind of have, I should have 2 notches, both with the back of my collar as well as the center back of my bodice. So I'm going to go ahead and start there, matching those up, and then try to get that to fit as best as I can. My back might be a little bit bigger than what I want my collar to be, so maybe let's see what I can do. The key is to really just kind of keep this fabric as flat as you can between these layers, This does take a little bit of finesse. It's not something that is done, I would say, overly quickly, because you really want to take the time to make sure that everything is matching up the best that you can. So really just kind of pull things flat and straight, and you might need to come back and reposition things after you think you have them pinned down. It's always good to take the time to kind of check all this stuff before you put that that thread seam in, instead of having to like retake something out. Alright, so the way that mine is I do have a little bit of extension on my bodice back, but I'm not going to stress out about that at all. And then what I'm going to do is I see that my my shoulder seam on my bodice is just kind of popping up a little bit. I'm just going to make sure that that's going to stay flat while I'm sewing, so I'm going to go ahead and put a pin in here. And I'm just going to do a quick glance at my front and the back, make sure that I don't have any weird bulky areas that may cause me some trouble in a moment. And I'm going to be stitching this at 1/4 inch of a seam allowance. And so what we could do is we could go ahead and like kind of sandwich this all together. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to put just a row of stitching at 1/8 of an inch in. I'm going to do it inside that seam allowance, and this is going to be really close to the edge because my seam is going to come in at 1/4 of an inch, but I want to put a row of stitching in next to it. I would say basting, but because we're going around a curved edge, we're going to want to keep our stitch length a little bit smaller. So I'm going to line this raw edge up with 1/8 of an inch. And I'm not going to worry about back tacking at this point, just because this isn't a seam. I'm mainly just kind of attaching these to keep everything in place for the next step. So I'm just going to go ahead and keep that raw edge lined up with the 1/8 inch guideline. So again, that's 1/8, and just slowly stitch along this whole edge here, connecting the collar to the bodice. And what your book talks about is you can actually take the time to do some like molding almost with your collar to fit so that you get the right stand and fall that you want with your collar. And it really just depends upon the, I would say, the tailoring needed for to complete the shirt that you're doing. I think that that's a very good step if you want to. I tried to do some molding over the tailor's hem and the sleeve roll, and because our collar is just so small, it's really hard to do that molding step. But know that it's a possibility, and your book references and talks about that. So just in the future, for when you advance onto your higher level courses, that when you need to do some tailoring or make, I would say, more high-end garment samples, that you might want to take that time to you know, to kind of refresh your memory when it comes to molding. And we'll kind of talk a little bit about that when we get the facing and everything else kind of attached here to our bodice. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and stop right now, and I'm going to go over to the ironing board, and I just want to make sure that this seam is pressed flat. So I'm just going to press this flat right along the edge here that I just sewed down, and make sure that all of this is laying flat, my fabric is laying flat underneath of my collar, underneath of my undercollar, because the next step is we're going to be placing our facing unit over the top of this and creating this all-in-one seam, and enclosing all of our raw outside edges along our center front and along our neckline opening. So it's always a good idea to take some time to press, and we'll be back in a second.